What's up, guys? It's TheDuckChris here, back with another ramble today. The last one went well, so I thought I'd continue. Today we're going to be talking about melee weapons, the niches they fill, and generally my thoughts on what we should do for future melee weapons. Melee weapons are used for a bunch of things in-game currently. It's one of the most popular styles, used a ton of bosses, so bossing is definitely a major niche. We also have Slayer. Melee Slayer used to be more popular, but still good for a lot of tasks. PvP and low-level monster clearing. Both niches, but still popular. So for bossing, everyone knows we have the Scythe. So the Scythe is currently the best in slot melee weapon on all bosses that you can melee, besides Arclight. More or less. I don't think I've forgotten any examples, but basically for any monster that's a boss, pretty much they're all at least 3x3, so it's going to hit 3 times. It's good for high defense bosses like Nightmare and Verzik P2. Also Sodaseg, Zarpist when you miss specs, like the Scythe is still good. But it's also good for low defense bosses like Verzik P3, Maiden, and Zarpist once you lower the defense. Ulm, and you can use Crush or Slash with the Scythe, of course. So it's a pretty interesting weapon. It's definitely like become super strong in terms of like it being the best in slot melee on every boss, despite there being the potential for attack style balancing and stuff. The lance and the mace are both very good also. The lance on dragon weapons and the mace on anything that's weak to crush, but not great against the Scythe. Some examples for the lance, obviously Ulm, Vorkath. I guess Vorkath is the only example in terms of a meleeable boss where the lance is better than the Scythe. Mostly because of the salve aiming, I think. But also, yeah, the mace is good against KQ, against Arachnus, against Tecton, a couple other places. So we do have like a little bit of variety in terms of melee bossing. And of course there's the Arclight, which is best in slot against Zami and also good against Sire, and second best, if I'm not mistaken, against Serb. So one thing that's interesting about the Scythe is it's good against both high defense monsters and low defense monsters. So we've seen Jagex do a bit of balancing with the blowpipe, where they wanted to make the blowpipe best only against low defense monsters and other things better against higher defense. So that's something that like you could change in terms of melee and only make the Scythe best against low defense, or maybe something that's even better on low defense and make the Scythe best on high defense. Because what's good about the Scythe versus high defense monsters is that it has 3 separate roles. So you're more likely to do at least a little bit of damage, as opposed to like a one-hit weapon like the mace, where it might be a bit more accurate on the individual hit versus each of Scythe's individual hits, but overall, once you hit a 0, it's a 0. Where the Scythe, you could hit a 0 on 2 of the attacks and then hit on the 3rd one. So it's more consistent damage versus high defense monsters. And that's one reason why the new proposal for the Raids 3 weapon, the Fang, the stab weapon that's consistent damage versus bosses, I don't understand why they would come up with something like that, because it's basically a role that the Scythe already fills. So the Scythe already does consistent damage versus bosses with high defense, so I don't understand, and it's 5 tick, of course. And so the new one is going to be 5 tick also and consistent damage versus bosses, and the only change is that it's stab instead of slash and crush. And we don't have a single monster where that's really relevant. You know, the Vasa crystals are weak to stab, but they're so weak that you can hit almost every time with any stab weapon, like a mace. So I don't see why this weapon would be needed there. Sire is a bit higher defense and weak to stab, but you have the Arclight. And the Arclight is already best in slot there in terms of its multiplicative damage and accuracy, so I don't see why the Fang would be useful there. So basically, the Fang won't be better than any of our current weapons in terms of the niche it fills. Or if it is, then it'll just make those weapons totally invalid for that niche. So I don't really think that in terms of bossing, that proposal is going to work. And frankly, like the weapons we have right now, the Scythe rules almost all bossing, and there's only small niches for the other weapons. You know, I mentioned the Lance on Ulm, but the Lance isn't even best in slot on Ulm, you know, in most raids. Like, yeah, if you're doing CMs with Inquisitor in a solo, then it's better. But otherwise, like, the Scythe is better than the Lance. And the Lance, like, already is pretty cheap, because everyone farms Hydra. So there's no reason to make it even less useful. So let's go to Slayer then. Slayer is the next niche that people use melee for. And yeah, it's not that useful compared to what it once was. It used to be in the old 2007 Scape, you know, before we had a lot of updates, melee was the go-to style for Slayer. It had the highest damage output on a standard monster, with the whip being better than, you know, a rune crossbow or even ACB later on. And magic just has never kept up DPS wise on single targets. And of course you could use it with a cannon as well, like all styles. But the thing is, these days Slayer has changed. We have barrage tasks. And barrage tasks, you know, with every update that we get to Slayer, whether it's extending, whether it's the Slayer cape, you know, allowing you to get back-to-back tasks, whether it's you know, the bracelets making your tasks go longer or your bad tasks go shorter, we're meleeing less and less. Barraging is becoming the highest source of Slayer XP output, and meleeing is just kind of relegated to those tasks that are the in-between tasks. And range also, like, of course you can chin if you want, or yeah, I can't think of anything else. I guess like some skip tasks you use like small blowpipes on to clear low level monsters. But yeah, so the rapier, the mace, and the what's it called? The blade, they're best in slot for single target melee. Scythe has some niches like on blood veil tasks and gargoyles, but mostly you're going to be using those rapier, mace, blade, and they don't really hold a ton of value for that specifically. Overall, I feel like melee Slayer is like the weakest style in terms of raw XP per hour, and maybe it could do with some upgrades. One thing that we have seen in terms of melee Slayer is spec restore alt. So you have a Crystal Halberd or a Din's Bulwark, and you do the special attacks over and over again with your alts, restoring your special attack, and that's like, it's good. It's very strong. It's like one way that melee is still used in Slayer, and you get a lot of XP doing it, of course. But of course, it's kind of situational. Like, if you don't have at least 2 alts doing it, then it's not really sustainable in terms of like consistent special attacks over and over. And a lot of people don't play with 2 alts just to do Slayer, so, you know, maybe that's a niche where we could improve it. So one idea that I had, what can I do with these fishbowls? 1 second. Yeah, one idea that I had was about melee Slayer. So say you had a weapon that could do what the Crystal Halberd spec does over and over again on its regular attacks, instead of just on the special attack. So whether it's, on just one tile, like barrage, or not barrage, but I guess like when you lure your Necreals in the catacombs all onto one tile, then say you swiped away with whatever weapon it is, and you hit all of them. This could be an interesting way to revitalize Melee Slayer, and it would make that weapon really valuable. Of course, this would be your probably best in slot melee experience, and it would give Melee a way to compete with Barrage in terms of Slayer. This would probably increase Slayer XP per hour overall, considering we have a lot more damage boost from Melee than we do from Magic. And of course, it would give you better Melee XP, so everyone would really want it. The question becomes do you want it to have charges? Do you want it to just be a very expensive weapon, like say it was the Fang that came from Raids 3 and it just hit AoE? That would definitely make it a very... I don't need to go here anymore. That would definitely make it a very popular item in terms of everyone would want it. And yeah, that would definitely keep value. So if it was very expensive, then not everyone could do it, but it would be something that people looked forward to in terms of long term. Do you want this to do Slayer? Maybe you get it before you grind 90 to 99. Maybe when you're an Iron Man, once you get it, then you unlock post 99 Slayer. There's a lot of potential for it. So one other thing that you could do, and this is something that has been done on RS3, is that their version of this weapon, their Scythe, has halberd range. So instead of just swiping on the one tile, it would swipe on multiple tiles. And you could do that for, say, a Dagonoth task in the Catacombs, where some of them are 2x2, and they don't really stack up properly. You could do it for a Bloodveld task, and this would give you even more tasks that you could use it on. And this could be, either just 2 tiles in front of you, or it could be all the way around you. Maybe it has a special attack where it hits everyone around you, kind of the Bulwark, or the Dragon Two-Hander has something like that. So there's definitely potential for Slayer with Melee to get a boost with a very expensive weapon. And I think this is definitely the most potential in terms of either this or bossing. I think the Slayer Melee has way more potential to get a good item and not really, devalue anything that we currently have. Because as I said, currently Melee Slayer, the upgrade from a whip to a rapier is so small that most people don't really bother with it, especially since Barrage is way more meta for Slayer. So after Slayer, the next niche that Melee currently has is PvP. And PvP, Melee is currently the best in slot style for KOing, with 3 options: the AGS, the Claws, and the Granite Maul. And I don't know really if we can improve on that. So one thing that Jagex is currently suggesting is the Zoros Godsword, or the Ancient Godsword. And the special on the Ancient Godsword is definitely meant to be a PvP type special, as far as I can tell, because if your target doesn't move, then they take an extra 20 damage after a cooldown period. Why do I keep doing this? After a cooldown period, and you heal a bit up. So it could make for some nice combos in terms of you freeze them, you Zoros Godsword spec them, and then you combo the delayed 20 damage with another big hit. It's okay. In terms of PvP, I'm sure it is, more interesting than not having a special, but ultimately, is it going to be better than AGS, Claws, or Granite Maul for 50% spec? I don't think so. You know, most of the time these days in PvP, if you're fighting someone who knows what they're doing, the only way you're going to kill them is to kill them all in one stack. And if they know that a 20 damage is coming like 8 ticks later, they could just eat up to full, you know, pop their vengeance and, you know, be prepared for anything that you throw at them. Like, if you're doing venge stacking, like, you know, it's way more valuable to have an AGSG maul. And if you're not doing venge stacking, if you're just doing like no honor hybriding, then like they're just gonna protect melee or do whatever, like eat up to full with their protect prayers on, and you're not gonna be able to KO them. So overall, I think this special attack like isn't good, and to make a special attack that rivals our current best spec weapons for melee, our KO weapons, it would be pretty hard to do without making it extremely overpowered. So I think the Zoro's Godsword needs a new special attack. The last niche that I have in terms of melee weapons is low-level monster clearing, which currently we just have the Ham Joint and the Swift Blade and the Event RPG. Low-level monster clearing is okay with these weapons, especially at places that, you know, are resistant to range, because currently range is the better style for this, with a 2-tick weapon in the blowpipe. And chins for AoE as well, fast AoE. But the Ham Joint and the Swift Blade are definitely good at certain places, like Nilo Room, also whatever that place is called, Nightmare, the Husks. You could come up with another melee weapon that fits this niche, but it would be hard to make it less, hard to make it not overpowered. You know, either you make it like blatantly stronger than the Ham Joint and Swift Blade, which kind of drops those weapons' value and utility. But those are already quite strong. Like if you make a 3-tick weapon that has stats, because the Ham Joint and Swift Blade have no stats, then yeah, you're going to start pumping out some real damage. And if you make a 2-tick weapon that has no stats, again, it's like just 50% more damage than the Ham Joint and Swift Blade. And that's down to how much of our gear, our melee gear, gives, you know, strength and attack bonus already. So even if you don't have a weapon, it's like you're doing a good amount of damage. I don't currently see us getting a new weapon like this, because I think the ones that we currently have are good enough. You know, they're able to hit like 20s on the Husks. So I don't really think that we need a new one. So I would not currently suggest any weapons for this niche. So that's kind of the full range of niches that melee weapons currently have in the game. One thing that I did want to touch on is like slash, stab, crush. Slash, stab, and crush are one of the most unique parts about melee as a style, in that they have 3 different offensive and defensive stats versus the other styles that just have one. And while this is really interesting, I think it could be even more fleshed out, and the mods have talked about this. You know, they don't really have any bosses that are weak to stab, besides Vasa Crystals, which have extremely low defense, so like any stab weapon can work on them. And Sire, which is weak to stab, but it's also weak to the Arclight. So the Arclight, you just put it on stab or even slash, and it's better than any stab weapon. So yeah, we could get more stab weapons, of course, if, you know, this we got more bosses that are weak to stab, but that kind of has to be done one step at a time. Like, if you get a boss that's weak to stab with no new stab weapons, then the rapier becomes good again. And I think that's a positive thing. You know, you don't have to introduce a brand new stab weapon when we already have a stab weapon that's pretty good and just isn't being used that much. And if you want to introduce a new stab weapon later, like, you can definitely do that because there's a proven niche for it. Slash, obviously we have the Scythe and the Blade, and they're both quite good. The Scythe being like far better than anything else, as long as it's 3x3 or even 2x2, it's quite good if you're willing to use the blood runes. And Crush, we have the Mace and the Scythe, and of course we have Inquisitor to increase the crush bonus. So overall, yeah, slash stab crush, it's a good niche, and it can be even more important in later content. But in terms of right now, I think we have all that we need in terms of the 3 niches. And one thing to consider also is that when you make new weapons in the future, those niches are going to kind of fall by the wayside. Unless you very specifically make something only one style. So if you have, take for example the Blade of Saeldor, it's primarily slash, but it also has stab. And if we didn't have any rapier or mace, it would also be best in slot stab, and it would probably replace the abyssal dagger at anywhere that stab was being used. And yeah, same for the mace. Obviously it has crush and stab, and the scythe also has slash and crush. So if you had a new scythe, for example, that was slash only and didn't have crush, then that's definitely one way to balance it and keep the niches open. But it's also very hard, it's a hard line to walk for a boss to have, enough defense that you can hit fairly decently. It has to be a high defense, but you have to still be able to kill it. But also restrict you to just one style. So that's something to consider with future content. Overall, I think melee, is a style that people have been using very much the same for a long time. Ever since the Scythe came out, not really much has changed. Like the mace is a very niche weapon at most. And it's still very expensive because it's rare, but, the Scythe is still the best in slot melee almost everywhere. And if you had any of the other weapons, like rapier or blade, you really didn't need to buy mace. So in terms of new melee weapons, it would definitely be interesting to tackle some of the niches that haven't been touched for a long time, like Slayer, or, of course, Stab. One thing that I didn't mention so far is Corporeal Beast. It's restricted to spear and halberd type weapons on Stab. This is kind of like one way that Jagex doesn't really balance stuff anymore, because it's kind of sloppy, but basically just giving a hard cap on anything that isn't a specific type of weapon. Like if you say, for example, what if the skeletal mystics in Chambers took half damage from anything that wasn't a crossbow? They could have done that, and then that would have given Armadyl crossbow and Dragon Hunter crossbow more of a niche, but it's just kind of random, and there's no real reason to do that. So I'm glad that they haven't been doing that as much, but the fact is Corp is in the game. It's been like this forever, since the original incarnation, and it's not really going to change, obviously. So yeah, one thing we could do, make a new spear, make a new halberd, but one thing that we do have to consider is that before the lance came out, the Hasta was already, or the Zamorakian spear was the best in slot spear, and it was not very expensive. It wasn't the only use either. You could use it as a Hasta. It was a good stab weapon, but the fact is that being best in slot at Corp and being like near best in slot stab is not enough to keep a weapon like really, really desirable. The Hasta only went up to 10 mil after it was given an item sync in the Dragon Hunter Lance. And that, obviously, the Lance is a much more powerful weapon that everyone wants versus a niche like Corp. So if you have a weapon like the Fang, like they've talked about, which is currently, either worse than the Scythe or better than the Scythe, and the Scythe becomes dead content, which I don't think they would ever do. So if it's just worse than the Scythe, but also best in slot at Corp, that doesn't mean it's going to be very expensive. And, when you want a new melee weapon that comes from a raid, it should be expensive. It should be very valuable, and it should be something that people really want to use and buy and do the raid to get, if you're an Iron Man, of course. So I think that basically, I'm not going to lie, the whole point of this ramble was that I think that the proposed rewards for both Nex and Raids 3 for melee are not very good. You know, I think the Zoro's Godsword needs a special attack that's actually useful in PVM. Something that's, you know, maybe best in terms of damage or in terms of stat reduction. Like, obviously we have the Dragon Warhammer, but that's kind of mid-level content these days. You know, everyone does shamans with a rune crossbow or magic shortbow, or, you know, maybe a blowpipe if they care to go to Zulrah first. But the Dragon Warhammer is not that expensive. So if you had the Zoro's Godsword as like a 1-bill weapon that does a little bit more stat reduction than the Dragon Warhammer, I think that would definitely be balanced. Or if it did a little bit more DPS than the claws, I think that would be balanced too. Obviously with DPS special attacks, you run again into the PvP scenario, but I'm sure they could find a way to make it more DPS on bosses and not more DPS on players. So that's something to consider. And then, of course, the Fang, as I said before, it's a stab weapon that we don't really need. It's a bossing 5-tick weapon that we don't really need. And I think that the better use for it would be best in slot melee slayer weapon. Whether that's total AoE, AoE in front of you, 1 tile, 2 tiles, maybe even 3 tiles, who knows. Special attacks versus regular attacks. I think it should be the best in slot melee slayer weapon. And that would make everyone really want it, especially me. So that's all that I really have to say in terms of melee weapons. Let me know what you think. What kind of niches does melee have currently that you would want rewards to fill? And what kind of niches do you see maybe that I've missed? Something that melee is used for that, you know, I haven't talked about and that maybe you would want improved. Or tell me that you don't want it improved. If you made it in this far in the video, feel free to drop a sub, because I'm going to keep doing these. I think it's really fun and a good way to get your thoughts out and figure out, you know, what we think about the future of the game. And a like on this video would help it reach more people. So thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm out.